The storm outside had turned brutal, lashing against the tall glass walls of the penthouse as Thomas Weller, CEO of Larkbridge Holdings, burst into the dimly lit apartment, his jaw clenched and coat soaked through. The security team had flagged unusual movement in his personal property, a space no one but him had access to. He kicked the door open with full force, expecting a thief or a trespasser, his voice already rising in anger. But the fury drained from his face as he froze in the doorway, staring at the smallest, most heartbreaking sight he'd ever seen. A little boy, no older than 6, stood on a stool, carefully stirring something in a dented saucepan over the stove. His cheeks flushed with heat and fear. The child didn't scream or run. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he turned slowly, his oversized sweater slipping off one bony shoulder, and looked straight at Thomas with hollow, exhausted eyes. "I'm making soup," he whispered, voice barely audible over the hiss of boiling water. "She said if I wait long enough, someone good would come." For a moment, the CEO couldn't breathe, couldn't move. His power, his title, his walls meant nothing in front of this child's quiet bravery. The room smelled like burnt onions and hope, and somehow it was more sacred than any boardroom he'd ruled. Where is your mother?" Thomas asked, his voice cracking, stepping forward like he was in a dream. The boy didn't answer immediately. He just stirred, then carefully turned off the burner like he'd done it 1,000 times, even though he could barely reach. "She left last week. She said she had to find help. But I think she's in trouble." His lips trembled, but no tears came. "I didn't want to leave the place. What if she came back and I wasn't here?" Thomas's hands slowly unclenched. His mind spun with disbelief, confusion, and something colder. Regret. The place was listed as a vacant company-owned property, his property. Why hadn't anyone told him someone was living here? Someone so small. Thomas looked around. The furniture was gone. A single mattress lay on the floor with a torn blanket, and next to it, a small stuffed rabbit with its ear missing. "You've been here? All alone?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. The child nodded, then finally looked down like he'd said too much. "I only cook when it's really cold, and I only eat a little. Mom said to stretch the cans." His words hit Thomas like glass to the chest. This wasn't just some neglected apartment. This was a home, a battlefield of survival, and this child had been fighting alone. Thomas slowly stepped further into the room, his shoes echoing against the wooden floor as if the silence didn't want to be disturbed. The child had gone back to stirring the pot, even though the stove was off, almost like he didn't know what else to do with his small hands. The CEO's throat tightened. He had sat across from billionaires and negotiated takeovers without blinking. But now, in the presence of a hungry, shivering child, he felt smaller than he'd ever been. "What's your name?" he asked gently, crouching near the stove, trying not to scare the boy. "Eli," the boy said, eyes not meeting his. His voice was rough, like he hadn't spoken much in days, maybe weeks. "My mom calls me Eli, but only when she's not scared." That last part made Thomas pause. And when was she not scared? The boy blinked slowly, then finally turned to him, his brown eyes deep and older than a 6-year-old's should ever be. "Before the letters came. Before the people with suits started knocking. Before she stopped singing." Thomas inhaled deeply. His own company had sent out eviction notices, hundreds of them. Maybe one of them had been hers. The boy tried to lift the pot, but it was too heavy. Thomas instinctively reached out to help, but Eli flinched and took a step back. "Don't take it," he said. "It's not much, but it's mine." Thomas, froze again, then slowly raised both hands. "I'm not here to take anything from you, I promise." There was a moment, a long, heavy pause, before Eli gave the tiniest nod. Thomas helped move the pot to the counter and found a single cracked bowl on the shelf. He filled it gently and handed it to the child, who whispered a thank you like it was a secret. Eli sat on the edge of the mattress, blowing on the soup, his knees tucked into his sweater. Thomas couldn't look away. "Do you have any family?" he asked. The boy shook his head without looking up. "Just Mom. She said once I had a dad, but he never stayed for dinner." The words stabbed at something buried deep in Thomas's chest. He sat down slowly on the floor, not wanting to tower over the boy. "What about neighbors? Did anyone come to check on you?" Eli hesitated. "The lady downstairs gave me crackers once, but then she moved. And someone else shouted a lot. I don't like shouting." Thomas noticed the scars on the wall near the doorframe, knife marks, like someone had thrown something. He also saw a child's handwriting on the wall behind the mattress, written in crayon. "Mom will be back soon. Be brave." The innocence in those crooked letters broke something in him. He reached for his phone, intending to call someone, anyone, but paused. This wasn't a case for social services or security. This wasn't about protocol. This was about a child who had been forgotten by a system that cared more about paperwork than people. A system he had built. "I'm staying here tonight," Thomas said quietly. Eli looked up sharply. "You don't have to. It's not even your house." Thomas gave a faint, almost broken smile. "Actually, it is. But now I think it's yours more than mine." Eli stared for a long time. Then, in a voice so small it barely existed, he asked, "Are you going to kick me out?" Thomas shook, his head slowly. "No, Eli. I'm going to try and bring your mom back. But first, I'm going to make sure you're not alone anymore." The boy blinked hard, then went back to sipping his soup. And for the first time, a tiny bit of color returned to his cheeks. Night fell, and the wind howled through the cracks in the windows, but the room held a strange warmth. Thomas sat on the floor near the mattress, watching Eli sleep. The boy had curled up like a kitten, holding the one-eared rabbit to his chest like it was a shield. The CEO leaned back against the wall, phone still in hand, dozens of messages ignored. For once, the deals could wait. He stared at the boy, trying to piece together how many times his company's policies had failed kids like this. Failed this kid. Failed mothers who slipped through the cracks. His mind flashed back to his own childhood, a room filled with silence, a father who only spoke when drunk, and a mother who left too soon. He'd buried those memories under money, under suits, under layers of power and pride. But now, in this broken apartment, it was like someone had dug them up and laid them bare on the floor. Eli stirred in his sleep and whispered something. "Mom." Thomas leaned forward, listening, but the boy settled again. His fingers tightened around the rabbit. Thomas whispered softly, "She's coming, Eli. I'll find her. I swear I'll find her." The next morning, Thomas made calls, not to lawyers or executives, but to shelters, hospitals, and even old colleagues who owed him favors. He described Eli's mother as best he could, based on what little the boy had shared. No name, no photo, just the words of a child who remembered her singing and the way she held his hand at night. By noon, someone responded. A woman matching the vague description had been seen at a church shelter a few neighborhoods away, disoriented, weak, and asking about her son. Thomas didn't hesitate. He called his driver, but this time he didn't wear his usual suit. He left the apartment dressed plainly, made sure Eli had food, and locked the door behind him. At the shelter, he walked in and asked for her. The woman who turned to face him looked nothing like what he expected. She was young, too young, her face gaunt, eyes swollen from crying. But the moment she heard Eli, she stood up so fast, she nearly fell. "Is he okay?" she gasped. "Where is he? Is he safe?" Thomas nodded slowly, then offered his hand. "He's waiting for you. Come with me." The woman clung to him like he was the last solid thing in a collapsing world. Back at the apartment, Eli sat by the window, holding the rabbit tightly, watching the street like it was the only thing that mattered. When the door finally opened and his mother rushed in, the boy didn't speak. He just ran into her arms, dropping everything. She sank to the floor, sobbing, holding him like she'd never let go again. Thomas stood quietly, hands in his pockets, his eyes burning with something he couldn't name. It wasn't pride. It wasn't relief. It was something deeper, something like redemption. "Thank you," she whispered between tears. "I thought no one would care. I thought I'd lost him." "You didn't," Thomas said softly, "but I nearly lost myself." Thomas stood near the doorway long after the boy and his mother had crumpled into each other like two halves of a soul finally stitched back together. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just watched. Something inside him, something tightly coiled and long ignored, began to loosen. His eyes drifted around the room again, but this time, it wasn't the cracked paint or broken blinds he saw. It was the absence of compassion, the vacancy of kindness, and he realized painfully that this apartment was a reflection of him. Cold, efficient, stripped of warmth. He stepped out into the hallway, and the sounds of the reunited family faded behind the door. For years, he had signed papers like they were meaningless, restructuring notices, cost-cutting memos, housing project shutdowns. He had told himself it was business, that families would find another place, that the numbers mattered more. But Eli's eyes, those eyes had told a different truth. Thomas felt like he was walking through a fog, his polished shoes tapping against a world he no longer recognized. The weight of years was pressing against his chest now, and for the first time, he couldn't breathe through it. He sat in the back of the car, staring out the window, but not really seeing the streets. His phone buzzed constantly. Messages from his assistant, reminders about his board meeting, a notification from a real estate partner about a new luxury complex. He turned the screen off without answering. "Take me to the shelter we donate to," he said quietly. The driver looked surprised but obeyed. When they arrived, Thomas didn't walk through the front as a benefactor. He went through the side door, the one volunteers used. He wanted to see it raw, honest, without filters or speeches. Inside, he saw the truth. People huddled together, not out of comfort, but survival. Mothers feeding toddlers cereal with trembling hands. Men who looked strong but whose eyes were lost. A little girl with missing teeth trying to draw a rainbow on the back of a torn envelope. No one knew who Thomas was. No one tried to impress him. That anonymity shattered something fragile inside him. A woman handed him a tray and pointed to the line. "You here to help or eat?" she asked plainly. He looked at the tray, then back at her. "Both, maybe, but I need to start by listening." He served food, poured water, cleaned tables. Hours passed. For the first time in decades, his suit remained on its hanger. His name went unspoken. And it was in that silence that he began to hear things, really hear. Stories of eviction, of jobs lost due to automation, of children sleeping in stairwells while CEOs toasted to profit margins. He realized the people hurt most by his empire never got to walk into his office. They were just names on spreadsheets, disposable. Until now. Until Eli. That child had unknowingly placed a mirror in front of him, and it had cracked him open. The next morning, he returned to his office, but something had shifted. He walked past his assistant without a word and sat alone in his glass-walled room, staring out at the skyline. All his life, he had climbed higher. Bigger deals, taller buildings, louder applause, but now, from the very top, all he could see was what he'd overlooked. He pulled out Eli's crayon drawing from his coat pocket, the one he had quietly picked up from the apartment floor. A child's sketch of a house, a woman, and a stick figure holding a bunny. Underneath it said, in red, "When we get better again." His throat tightened. He picked up the intercom. "Cancel all my meetings today," he said. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He picked up a pen, a notebook, and started writing by hand. He didn't write business plans or shareholder statements. He wrote names, real people, people he remembered seeing evicted from projects, elderly residents who begged for extensions, single mothers who wrote letters he never read, and for each name, he wrote one word beside it: failed. The list grew. By the time the sun dipped behind the skyscrapers, the page was full, and so was his guilt. Thomas called a board meeting, but instead of showing charts, he showed faces. He stood in front of the room full of executives and displayed photos taken at shelters. He played a voice recording from a mother who lost her apartment during one of their redevelopment initiatives. The room grew uneasy. "We have the power to change this," he said. "And if we don't, then we don't deserve our positions." Some scoffed, some looked away, but a few, just a few, nodded. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Changing a culture built on profit was like steering a ship through a storm. But storms cleared, eventually. He took a bold step, announced a new foundation under his company, funded not by donations, but by redirecting bonuses, profit percentages, and luxury budgets. He called it Eli's Hope, focused on emergency housing, rent forgiveness, and education programs for children affected by displacement. "We can't give them back their time," he said in the press conference, "but we can give them dignity." For once, the media didn't paint him as a hero. They asked why it took this long, and he didn't flinch. "Because I was blind," he answered. "Because I forgot the cost of silence. But I'm listening now." Back at the apartment, weeks later, Eli sat on a cleaner mattress. His mother had a job through one of the outreach partners Thomas connected her with. There was light in the room now, literal and emotional. The boy laughed as Thomas helped him assemble a small bookshelf. The CEO struggled with the screws, and Eli giggled. "You're not good at this," he teased. Thomas chuckled. "That's true, but I'm learning, and I had a good teacher." The boy looked up. "Me?" Thomas nodded. "You reminded me that people matter more than buildings, that a warm meal means more than cold numbers." Eli's mother watched from the corner, wiping a tear. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas turned to her, voice soft. "No. Thank you for not giving up on him, on yourself." He looked around the small space, and on the world. That night, Thomas sat alone in his office again, the city lights blinking below. But this time, he didn't feel detached. He felt connected, through pain, through redemption. Through one child who cooked alone in the dark, and in doing so, lit a fire that changed everything. The rain hadn't stopped in hours. Outside, the city hummed with impatience, horns blaring, tires slicing through puddles, but inside the tiny apartment, time slowed. Thomas sat on the floor beside Eli, who clutched a soggy drawing pad, his fingers stained with crayon wax. Storm had knocked out the power, and the room was lit only by the flickering light of a candle resting on a tin can. Eli's knees were drawn to his chest. He hadn't spoken in minutes, not since he saw the eviction notice that had slipped under the door again. This time, it wasn't a mistake. It was a reminder. Thomas stared at the paper, unable to speak. The eviction wasn't his doing, not this time. But it was still his system, his legacy. One of his lower-level managers had flagged the address for redevelopment again, even after all the changes Thomas made, even after he promised. And here was this boy, this fragile thread in the story of his awakening, being threatened again by the very thing Thomas swore to fight. He felt the heat of shame creep into his neck. "I'm so sorry, Eli," he whispered, barely audible. "I didn't know this would happen." The boy didn't answer. He just kept coloring in silence. The page he was working on was a sketch of a large building, glass windows, a rooftop garden, and a big gold sign above the door that read, "Home for Everyone." At the bottom, Eli had drawn dozens of smiling faces. One of them had short brown hair, square glasses, and a necktie, drawn in green. It was Thomas. Eli handed him the page without looking up. "I thought this place would be real someday," he said softly. "But maybe it was just pretend." His voice didn't carry anger, just disappointment. It was the kind of heartbreak that doesn't yell. It sinks, slow and deep. Thomas felt something twist in his chest, not guilt. That had already settled. This was different. It was fear. Fear that he had inspired hope, only to crush it by accident. "It's not pretend," he said, clearing his throat. "That place you drew, we're going to build it. Not a sketch, a real building, with real people. And no one gets kicked out." Eli looked at him finally. His eyes were wet. "But they're still making us leave," he said. "My mom cried in the bathroom again. I heard her." Thomas's voice broke. "Then they'll have to kick me out too, because I'm not leaving either." Eli blinked, confused. "You don't live here." Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out a legal envelope. Inside was a signed document, transferring ownership of the building to a new non-profit housing initiative. "I do now," he said, handing the paper to Eli. "And I promise you, no one else will ever knock on this door to take your home away again." For a moment, Eli didn't move. Then, slowly, his lip trembled. "Do you mean it?" Thomas nodded. "With all I have left." The boy dropped the drawing pad and threw his arms around Thomas's neck, holding him tighter than he'd held anyone since he was a child. The warmth of Eli's hug, that tiny frame clinging to him, as if to say, "Don't leave me like the others," sent Thomas spiraling back through time. He remembered being 5, hiding under a table, his father shouting, his mother crying. No one came to help. No one promised him anything. He had sworn to become powerful so no one could ever hurt him again. But in doing so, he had hurt others. And here was Eli, offering him something purer than power, trust. Undeserved, unearned, but freely given. That hug shattered everything cruel he had built around his heart. "I wanted to be like you when I grow up," Eli said against his shoulder. "But I don't want to make people cry." Thomas swallowed, the lump in his throat. "Then be better than me. Be someone who listens when others don't. Someone who protects, even if it costs you something." Eli leaned back and looked at him. "Will you help me?" Thomas smiled, tears now running freely. Every step of the way. In that moment, the storm outside seemed to soften, as if the world had paused just long enough to let two broken pieces finally fit. Later that night, Eli's mother emerged from the bedroom, her eyes red but clearer than before. Thomas explained everything: how the deed had changed, how the threats would stop, how they would rebuild not just this apartment, but dozens like it. She didn't say much. She simply nodded, walked over to Eli, and kissed the top of his head. Then she looked at Thomas, her voice steady. "Why us? After everything?" He hesitated, then answered, "Because you reminded me what grace looks like, and because you never stopped believing even when it was hard." Her eyes glistened with gratitude. Thomas left the apartment after midnight, the city glimmering beneath the wet streets. He didn't head home. Instead, he walked, block after block, past buildings he once purchased, signs he once approved, corners where the invisible ones slept. He saw them now, every single one, and they saw him. Some recognized him, others looked away. But he stopped at each one, offering blankets, offering his coat, sometimes just words. He no longer needed to be the man at the top. He needed to be the man who showed up when no one else did. And so he kept going, not as a CEO, not as a philanthropist, but as a man transformed by the quiet resilience of a child. He would build that home for everyone. He would write laws, push policies, create networks that couldn't be bought or broken. Not because it made good press, but because one boy believed he could. And that belief, that fragile, innocent belief, was the most valuable thing Thomas had ever been given. He would never let it break again. The boardroom was colder than usual. The windows stretched from ceiling to floor, offering a breathtaking view of the skyline. But Thomas didn't glance at it once. He stood at the head of the long glass table, surrounded by men and women in sharp suits, people who once followed his every word without question. But today, their expressions were guarded. He held a folder in his hand, his final folder. Inside it were signed documents transferring all his remaining shares in the company to a new public housing trust. Every penny, every title, every last echo of control. He laid it on the table and simply said, "I'm stepping down." The room exploded in murmurs. One of the senior partners leaned forward, eyes wide. "Thomas, you built this empire. You're our face. You've been here 27 years. You're telling us you're walking away for what?" Thomas met her gaze without blinking. "For someone who reminded me that shelter isn't a luxury. It's a right." Another man shook his head. "This will tank our valuation. Investors will run." Thomas nodded calmly. "Then let them run. I'd rather lose investors than look into another child's eyes and see myself at 5 years old, helpless, alone, invisible." He stood tall as silence rippled through the room. No news outlet reported it. There were no interviews, no headlines that morning. Thomas had quietly rewritten the foundation of the company's wealth without ever holding a press conference, and he didn't want one. The luxury car he once loved sat untouched in the garage. The penthouse was listed for donation to a shelter transformation project. One by one, he erased the symbols of success that had defined him, but not out of guilt, out of choice. It wasn't punishment, it was peace. Silent, but steady peace that came from giving instead of grasping, and it hurt more than he'd admit aloud. That night, he visited Eli again. The boy was asleep, sprawled across the couch with crayon marks smudged on his chin. His mother looked up from a worn book, her eyes filled with curiosity. "You're "Not wearing your suit," she said gently. He smiled, glancing down at the old wool sweater he'd dug from storage. "I won't be needing it anymore." She stood, nervous. "What happened?" He handed her a folded paper. She opened it. Her hand covered her mouth. It was the deed, not just to the building, but to the entire block. Her knees gave way, and she dropped to the couch, stunned. "Why?" she whispered. "Because no one ever did it for me." He didn't wait for applause. He tucked the boy's blanket higher, pressed a gentle hand to his forehead, and turned to leave. She called after him, "You'll lose everything." His footsteps paused at the door. "No," he said softly. "I just found everything I was missing." Then he stepped into the cold night, alone. Behind him, a family slept safely for the first time in years. And in another part of the city, lights flicked on in a new building, one he had anonymously funded. It would bear no name, no plaque, no tribute, but it would hold 200 beds and a warm meal every night. Over the next few months, rumors swirled. "Did you hear the old CEO gave away his fortune?" "No way, not him. That guy was stoned." But he never corrected them. While others debated his motives, he was in the kitchen of a shelter teaching Eli how to make pancakes. While others fought over assets and mergers, he was sweeping floors with former tenants who now smiled like neighbors. One woman cried when she recognized him in a donated coat. You're the one who..." He just smiled, placed a finger to his lips and whispered, "Let's just say I'm helping out." His legacy would not be on the side of a skyscraper, but in the stories whispered between mothers and children who no longer feared eviction. It would be in the drawings Eli taped to the community fridge. It would be in the elderly man who now had insulin and a bed, instead of a park bench and fear. No grand speech would mark Thomas's change. No camera would record it. But the streets remembered. The corners remembered. And most importantly, the children remembered. The man who gave everything so they could keep something. He passed by his old building once, now a repurposed community center. A little girl with braids ran up to him with a clipboard. "Mister, do you want to sign our thank you wall?" He hesitated, then leaned down and smiled. "Only if I can sign someone else's name." She giggled. "Whose?" He thought for a moment. "Eli's," he said. "Write it big. He's the reason this place exists." As she scribbled it in bright purple marker, Thomas walked away again. No glory, no photos. Only quiet steps toward a better world he'd chosen to build brick by silent brick. It started with the notice. Thomas found it fluttering against the rusted gate of the shelter at sunrise. Eviction, final warning. Bold letters stamped with cold legality. His heart clenched. This wasn't just a building anymore. This was Eli's home. This was where his mother finally slept without checking over her shoulder, and someone wanted to tear it down. Thomas stormed inside, fury masked behind calm resolve. He'd given up his title, not his voice. He stood in the entryway, staring at the trembling paper, and whispered, "Not while I'm breathing." The fire in his chest hadn't dimmed. It had only changed targets. At the mayor's office, they tried to push him aside. "You're no longer CEO," a smug assistant said, stacking files without looking up. "This isn't your fight." Thomas leaned across the desk slowly. "You're right. I'm not a CEO anymore. I'm something far more dangerous. I'm a man with nothing to lose and everything to protect." The assistant scoffed. "You think you can stop the city?" Thomas's voice dropped. "Watch me." That afternoon, he filed an injunction. At midnight, he met with 3 lawyers he once fired for being too idealistic. Now they were his army, He wasn't just playing defense. He was preparing for war. Word spread fast. The shelter kids called him Mr. T now. One boy whispered, "He's like Batman, but real." Eli followed him everywhere, carrying a toy badge Thomas had carved from scrap wood. At hearings, Thomas stood tall while developers sneered. "Why do you care about these nobodies?" One whispered. Thomas turned. "Because they cared about me when I was a nobody, and that makes them family." His voice cut through every insult, every legal trick. When they tried to delay proceedings, he camped outside the courthouse. When they smeared his name in the press, he smiled and handed out hot cocoa to reporters. One morning, Thomas found graffiti on the shelter's wall. "This is slum land. Get out!" Eli stood beside him, confused. "Are we going to leave?" Thomas knelt, locking eyes with him. "Never. This is your home, and I will fight until my last breath to keep it that way." That day, he arranged cameras, called in favors, and broadcast the shelter's stories live. Mothers shared how they escaped abuse. Children showed their school awards. An old man named Gregory wept into the mic. "I'd be dead if not for this place." The tide began to shift. Even the public, once indifferent, now listened. When the city offered him hush money to walk away, he refused. "You're trying to buy silence," he said. "But I've lived in silence too long. You want me quiet? Then shut me up in court." They didn't expect him to mean it. He filed a civil case, not just for the shelter, but for unlawful targeting of all low-income homes in the district. "You'll lose everything," one city official hissed. "I already did," Thomas replied, "and I survived. Can you say the same?" The official's glare faltered. Thomas wasn't bluffing. He was daring the system to fight him, and the system wasn't ready. Eli had a fever one night. Thomas stayed by his side all night, dampening cloths, whispering stories, his voice cracking with fear. "You have to get better, buddy. I need you to see how this ends. I need you to believe that people can be better." The next morning, with red-rimmed eyes, he walked into court and faced a panel of judges who already had their minds made up. But he didn't beg. He roared. "If this building falls, you're not just tearing down walls, you're tearing down dreams, lives, second chances. Are you ready to live with that?" Silence followed, and then a single judge leaned forward. "Continue." His determination spread like wildfire. A woman from his old company donated supplies. A construction crew volunteered to renovate the building for free. Retired teachers offered tutoring inside the shelter. What had been a lonely fight became a movement, and still, Thomas stood at the front of it all, hands calloused, eyes unwavering. At night, he'd sit with Eli on the steps, watching the city lights. "You're strong," Eli said once softly. Thomas looked down at him. "No, you make me strong. I see you. And I remember who I was before I gave up. And I'll never let you feel alone like I did." 1 week before the final ruling, a pipe burst in the shelter. Water flooded the kitchen. Thomas could have called for help, but instead, he stripped to his undershirt and started scooping water with a bucket. Others joined in, laughing despite the mess. "This is what family does," he said. "We show up, we fight, we fix what breaks together." His voice shook as he looked around. "And they want to take this from us?" The room fell quiet. Then applause erupted. They weren't just fighting to keep a roof. They were fighting for the man who had become their shield, their protector, their living proof that one person could change everything. When the ruling day came, the shelter was packed. Media outside. Families inside. Thomas stood alone at the podium, hands folded, heart pounding. The judge read the verdict slowly. This court rules in favor of the defendant. The eviction is hereby nullified. The property shall remain protected. The words washed over him like a storm of light. Cheers erupted, tears streamed, and Eli leapt into his arms. Thomas didn't speak. He just held the boy close, the one he had protected with every ounce of strength, every piece of soul he had left. He had won, not for glory, but for love. Long before he found Eli, long before the headlines and the shelter battle, Thomas once walked hallways filled with marble and silence. He had power then, too much of it. People didn't look him in the eye, they obeyed. He wore tailored suits and cold smiles. Back then, his voice could fire a man in 3 words, and one of the men he fired was named Jonah Reed, a janitor. Quiet, older, slower than the others, but kinder than all of them. And Thomas never forgot the day he humiliated Jonah in front of the entire staff, just for being late after visiting his sick wife in the hospital. At the time, he had no sympathy. "You work on my clock, or not at all," he said, stepping over Jonah's mop like it was dirt. That single moment had made him feel powerful, but years later he remembered Jonah's eyes. They didn't show anger. They showed sadness, disappointment, like a man watching a child destroy something beautiful without understanding the cost. It haunted him. Even now, with Eli's hand in his, Thomas sometimes woke at night with that memory. How silence fell. In the lobby, how no one spoke up for Jonah, and how Thomas didn't care. That was the man he used to be, and he hated him. Redemption didn't begin with speeches or protests. It began with Thomas tracking down Jonah's family. The old man had passed away 2 winters ago in a public nursing home. "He never blamed you," the nurse had said. "He just always wondered why you were so angry." That shattered something in Thomas. He sat in his car, staring at his own reflection in the windshield, and whispered, "I didn't know. I didn't know I could hurt someone and never notice." He started writing letters that night, not to executives or lawyers, but to every name he remembered stepping on during his rise. Apologies, not excuses. Some never replied. Others did. One wrote, "I don't need your forgiveness. Just treat the next person better." That one stuck. From that day forward, he vowed to be different, not just for show, but in the dark moments no one saw. When no one was watching, that's when redemption had to live. At the shelter, he started washing dishes with the other volunteers. When a boy broke a window, Thomas didn't shout. He sat beside him and taught him how to fix it. "We all mess up," he said. "But we learn, we build, we grow." The boy nodded slowly, and Thomas saw something change in his eyes. During a community dinner, an elderly woman pulled him aside. "You don't remember me, do you?" she asked. "You bought the building where my store was. It closed down." Thomas's stomach sank. "I was just trying to expand the headquarters," he muttered. She nodded. "I lost everything, but I see you here, feeding people, carrying groceries. It doesn't fix the past, but it helps heal the future." Thomas stood frozen as she hugged him gently. "Keep going, son. You're doing good." He broke down later that night, alone in the hallway. That's when he knew redemption wasn't about being perfect. It was about never looking away from who you used to be. He created a new division at his old company, rehiring and retraining workers who had been let go unfairly. He didn't ask for press. He didn't even let them use his name. But the former employees knew. They saw the change in his eyes. They saw the humility in his hands. At a meeting one afternoon, a young woman spoke up. "You fired my father 5 years ago," she said calmly, "and he never forgave himself for not standing up to you." Thomas bowed his head. I was. Wrong, he replied. I can't undo it, but I'm here now, and I promise I'll fight for every name I once forgot. In the middle of winter, he visited Jonah's grave. A small stone, no flowers, just the name and the years. Thomas knelt and placed a scarf over the headstone. I never said thank you, he whispered. You were the first person I hurt who made me see myself, and I never forgot you. Snow began to fall. Eli stood nearby, watching. Who was he? Thomas looked up. A man I treated badly, but he taught me something no one else did. Eli reached out and took his hand. Maybe he forgave you. Thomas smiled faintly. Maybe. But what matters is that I live like I deserved it. When city council offered him a position, full salary, executive title, he declined. I'm not doing this for power, he said. I'm doing this because I need to earn back the right to walk into this building with my head held high. The mayor raised an eyebrow. You already have. Thomas shook his head. Not yet, but I'm getting closer. He walked out and returned to the shelter, where he helped fix a broken heater. With frozen hands and a bruised heart, he laughed with the children. He didn't need a corner office. He didn't need a company car. He needed that laughter, that warmth, that truth. The people he once dismissed now called him brother, father, friend. One woman who once scrubbed the floors of his skyscraper hugged him tight. You remember me? She asked. You never looked at me back then. Thomas swallowed hard. I'm looking now, and I'm sorry. She smiled through tears. That's all I ever needed. In that moment, he knew redemption doesn't erase the past. It just makes peace with it. And sometimes it gives others permission to heal too. His mistakes were real. His regret was real. But so was the change. And that change, earned through pain, was what made him whole again. The storm hit just after midnight. Thunder cracked above the shelter like the sky itself was angry. Wind slammed against the boarded-up windows, and the power flickered out. Darkness fell instantly, and with it came panic. Children screamed. Eli clutched Thomas's arm, eyes wide. It's okay, Thomas whispered, though he wasn't sure it was. This building was old, too old to stand against a storm like this. He grabbed a flashlight and made his way toward the boiler room, where the backup generator was supposed to be. But he hadn't checked it in weeks. That guilt clawed at his throat as he moved faster. Down the stairwell, water was already seeping through the cracks. The basement was flooding. The generator sat in the far corner, dead, useless. He tried it anyway. Once, twice. Nothing. His hands trembled. There were 60 people upstairs, most of them children and single mothers. No heat, no power, and water rising fast. His phone had no signal. He turned and sprinted back up the stairs, slipping twice. We need to evacuate, he told the shelter volunteers. Now! But the streets outside were already rivers. They couldn't leave. Then we moved them upstairs, Thomas barked. Top floor, away from the flood. No one argued. Everyone moved. Eli helped carry blankets. Thomas kicked open storage doors, grabbed emergency supplies he forgot they even had. His heart pounded like a drum. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice whispered, "You failed again." But louder than that voice was another, Eli's voice, echoing from the day they met. Sometimes people just need someone to fight for. Them. That thought pushed him harder. He carried a boy with asthma up 3 flights of stairs, his arms burning. He helped an elderly woman climb the last step. Then he turned and saw the worst thing possible. Smoke. Thin, curling smoke coming. From the electrical room. There's a short, shouted one of the volunteers. "Water's inside the fuse box!" Panic surged again. "Keep everyone upstairs," Thomas ordered. "Don't let them come down for anything." He grabbed a wet cloth and wrapped it around his mouth. Against every instinct, he charged back, downstairs. The smoke thickened fast. He couldn't see, couldn't breathe. He crawled now, guided only by memory. His hands burned against the hot walls. Sparks flew above him. One wrong move, and it could ignite everything. He reached the fuse box, opened it, yanked every breaker he could reach. The sparks stopped, but so did the lights. The entire building went dark. He was on the floor, coughing violently, lungs full of smoke, when someone pulled him by the collar. It was Eli. "You said not to come down," Thomas gasped. "You lied to me," Eli said, eyes full of fire. "I'm not leaving you." Together, they dragged each other upstairs, stumbling into the cold hallway. The volunteers clapped. Children cheered. The building was dark, but it was safe, for now. But Thomas collapsed. His chest was tight. His vision swam. Someone screamed. "Call for help." But there was no signal. "Please," Eli whispered, clutching his hand. "Please don't die. You said you wouldn't leave me." Thomas's lips barely moved. "Not done yet." Hours passed. The storm raged. But the building stood. At dawn, the skies cleared, and first responders finally arrived. They carried Thomas to the ambulance. Eli refused to let go of his hand. In the hospital, machines beeped steadily. Doctors spoke in whispers. Eli sat by his bedside for 2 days, straight. When Thomas finally opened his eyes, the boy broke into tears. "You're alive," he said. Thomas smiled weakly. "Told you. Not done." That moment, small and quiet, was when the reporters arrived. But they didn't see a CEO. They saw a man who risked his life for people the world forgot. Word spread quickly. The story reached every major news outlet. CEO turns shelter savior. From billionaire to hero. But Thomas didn't care. He sat in the hospital bed, watching the shelter on a small TV, live coverage of the children smiling in the sunlight. They had survived. Together. The shelter had been damaged, but the people were safe. Inspired by Thomas's actions, dozens of volunteers poured in from across the city. Donations tripled. A contractor offered to rebuild the shelter for free. One little boy wrote a letter that simply said, "You saved my life. I want to be like you." When Thomas returned, the children lined up in the hallway, clapping softly. One girl handed him a paper crown. "You're our king now," she said. He knelt, letting her place it on his head. "No," he whispered. "You all are." The roof still needed fixing. The walls still leaked. But that day, hope returned. Not because of money, not because of fame, but because one man had walked into a burning hallway for people who had no one else. Thomas stood taller than ever before, not because he was proud, but because he was finally, truly alive. 6 months later, the shelter no longer looked like a forgotten corner of the world. The once cracked windows now gleamed in the morning sun. The roof, rebuilt by volunteers and funded by thousands of anonymous donors, stood strong against new rains. Inside, the smell of fresh bread replaced the stale scent of despair. Where silence once echoed, laughter now lived. Children painted. The walls with bright colors and handprints, red, blue, yellow, and signed their names with pride. It wasn't just a shelter now. It was a home. Thomas stood outside the building, watching a girl chase a balloon across the grass. She fell, giggled, and got back up. He smiled quietly. His suit was long gone, replaced with rolled-up sleeves and calloused hands. The board of directors had accepted his resignation months ago. He hadn't looked back, not once. Because here, among the scraped knees and sticky fingers, he'd found something even billions couldn't buy. Peace. Real, soul-deep peace. And for the first time in years, he could breathe without shame sitting on his chest. Eli came running, up the hill with 2 sandwiches. "You skipped lunch again?" he said, eyes narrowed like a tiny parent. "You gotta eat." Thomas chuckled and took a bite. "Thanks, boss." Eli beamed, then looked out at the field. "Remember when I cooked eggs alone in that broken pan?" Thomas nodded, the memory still etched into his heart like a scar. "You changed everything," he said, but Eli shook his head. "No, you did. I just reminded you who you really were." Thomas didn't reply. He didn't need to. The truth was shining right in front of him. A ribbon-cutting ceremony was held that afternoon. No press, no fanfare. Just families, neighbors, and the smell of cinnamon rolls baking inside. They gathered around as Thomas spoke quietly, almost shyly. "This place saved me too," he said. "I came in broken, angry, empty, but I met a boy who wouldn't let me give up, and a community that taught me love doesn't have a price tag." Applause filled the yard, not because of grandeur, but because the words rang true. They'd all lived the journey. They'd all earned this new beginning, together. Later that evening, Eli placed a note on Thomas's desk. It said, "Thank you for kicking that door open." Beneath it, he'd drawn a picture of the 2 of them, holding hands under a bright sun with the word family written above. Thomas stared at it for a long time. Then he framed it and placed it on the wall beside his office door. Not CEO, not founder, just Thomas, a man who had finally come home. Outside, the children's laughter continued, and somewhere deep inside his chest, a door opened, not with a kick this time, but with a gentle, grateful hand.